France fell to Germany in the early months of World War II, and the pro-German Vichy government took over the colonial rule of Vietnam, Ho believed that the moment had arrived. In early 1941, he slipped across the Chinese border and into the jungles of North Vietnam. Incredibly, this was the first time Ho had set foot in his homeland in over 30 years. He was armed only with his ideas, but he was determined to lead a revolution, to liberate his country, or to die trying. When Ho Chi Minh walked across the border into North Vietnam in 1941, it marked the first time he had set foot in his country since 1911. He had no weapons, almost no money, and very little support. But he was determined to organize a guerrilla movement that would drive the foreigners from his country.
He calls the movement the Viet Minh, which is an acronym for Independence League. And he takes for the first time this name Ho Chi Minh, which means roughly bringer of light. So Ho Chi Minh begins to exist under that name, the famous name, now, 1941.
Well, there seems to be something of a myth that Ho Chi Minh, when he came back to Vietnam after 30 years of absence, was looked upon by, quote, everybody as the leader of Vietnam. I doubt that that's the case, because there was not the kind of media ability to influence the thought of people in the countryside. At that time, 90, maybe 95% of the people in Vietnam lived in small villages and cultivated rice.
There were educated Vietnamese in big cities like Hanoi and Saigon who greatly admired Ho's writings under his pen name Nguyen the Patriot. But they were in the minority. The vast majority of the people in the country were not familiar with Ho or his work. In fact, most of them could not read.
So his main aim was how to communicate and become close to the peasants. So he managed to adopt this very popular style, talking very simply to the peasants and being like an uncle, a member of the family.
Ho brought the role that his father had played as the avuncular village mandarin or local public official to a national level. Though some critics believe that this persona was nothing short of a calculated act, it was effective and the movement gained momentum.
I think Ho Chi Minh's goal determined his behavior. In order to reach the masses, he had to be looking and acting and living like a peasant, to be in communion with the needs of the peasants.
Ho and his followers also promoted the notion that he was a lifelong celibate who didn't have time for romance or a family because he was so devoted to his cause. This was a myth.
It's fairly clear now that he had several relationships. Whether they were formal marriages or not is difficult to substantiate because there are no certificates that we can point to. It's quite well established that he had either a Chinese wife or a Chinese concubine when he was in Hong Kong. No one knows at this point what happened to that woman.
If Ho was married when he returned to Vietnam, it was to his cause. He was much more interested in finding the right people to form the nucleus of his movement. One of Ho's best decisions was to enlist the help of a talented young man named Vo Nguyen Giap. Giap had a brilliant military mind and was a born leader. But when Giap and his men first encountered Ho, they didn't know who he was or why they should follow him. Ho told them that he had been trained in Moscow and that he was going to liberate the country by using the proven methods of his hero, Lenin. Giap and his men, and hundreds of others, soon joined Ho.
I never thought of him as a revolutionary as much as an organization man. What he was a genius at was his ability to organize movements, the front organization particularly.
A popular front is simply a group of groups united in a single purpose. Ho brought many of the other Vietnamese nationalist organizations together under his banner. But in order to do this, he had to focus on the issues that would appeal to the broadest possible group.
One was the issue of national independence, and the other was what might loosely be called social justice, which would mean land reform, better working conditions, democratic rights, and things of that type. You note here not a single word about communism, about collectives, about nationalization of industry, but very simple humanistic ideas that the vast majority of the Vietnamese people could accept.
On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and then launched an all-out attack against the British and Dutch colonies of Southeast Asia. Within weeks, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and Indonesia had all fallen to the Japanese Empire. The Japanese called off their attack on French Indochina when the local pro-Nazi Vichy colonial administration agreed to collaborate with Japan, Germany's Axis partner.
Ho could very well have said, okay, I will side with the Japanese because they're like Asians. But he came to the conclusion, very wisely, that the Japanese are no better than the French. They're both aliens. Neither one of them is going to do us any good.
Ho Chi Minh traveled to South China. Since the Chinese were also fighting Japan, he believed that he could get some military aid from the nationalist Chinese. To his surprise, he was arrested by the local authorities because he was a communist. Ho was thrown into prison. He kept a journal, writing mostly in the Chinese of his youth, in hopes of converting his captors to his point of view. In one poem he wrote, "My heart travels 1,000 miles toward my native land. Innocent, I have now endured a whole year in prison. Using my tears for ink, I turn my thoughts into verse." Ho's health deteriorated as the months passed. He had to find a way out of prison, or he would never live long enough to liberate Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh spent 14 months enduring the worst imaginable treatment in prison. As the war worsened for the Chinese, Ho convinced his captors to release him so that he could gather intelligence on the Japanese. He was released in 1943 and walked all the way back to his old base in North Vietnam. His co-patriots were stunned. They thought he had died. Once again, he became the leader. He was 53 years old.